Welcome again. So welcome again, and we will proceed with our third topic for this panel, Re-engineering the Economy, with the topic entitled The Engines of the Lebanese Economy by Dr. Ishaq Diwan, who will be joining us over Zoom. Dr. Diwan is the Professor of Economics and Chair of the Economy of the Arab World at Paris Sciences and Lettres. He is a PhD holder in Economics from the University of California, Professor of Economics at Paris Sciences et Lettres, Chair of the Economy of the Arab World, Paris Sciences et Lettres, previous World Bank Country Director in East and West Africa, Director of the Political Economy Program of the Economy Research Forum, where he's carrying out 2 projects on the study of crony capitalism and the analysis of opinion surveys, authors of multiple widely published books and articles focused on the political economy of the Middle East and broader development issues, such as the publication of a Political Economy of the Middle East 2015 and Crony Capitalism in the Middle East 2019. Dr. Ishaq Diwan will be joining us over Zoom. I don't know if you are able to hear me. Can you confirm that?
Yes, very well. How about you? Can you hear me?
Yes, fine, thank you. Allow me as well to introduce Dr. Wissam Harake. Dr. Harake is the World Bank Senior Economics for Lebanon. He joined the institution's Macroeconomics and Fiscal Management Global Practices in August 2013. Dr. Harake currently works on in-depth microeconomic research, analysis, monetary and market monitoring, and forecasts. He is the principal author and team leader for the Lebanon Economic Monitor, LEM, which is the main regular publication by the World Bank on Lebanon's macroeconomy and the source of the bank's macroeconomic forecasts. Before joining the bank, Dr. Harake worked at the Institute of International Finance in Washington, D.C. from 2011 till 2013 as an economist in the Africa Middle East Department, where he conducted in-depth macroeconomic analysis and forecast for selected countries in the region like Iraq, Ghana, Jordan, Kuwait, Libya, and Qatar. Dr. Harake, can you hear me?
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I can hear
Perfect.
you. Am I heard?
Yes, you are heard very clearly. Let me now again remind the rules for our sessions, the ground rules for our session. So we'll have 40-minute session allocated as such, 15 minutes to Dr. Ishaq for presenting his paper, and then 7 minutes for Dr. Harake to comment and discuss and analyze the paper, and the remaining time will be allocated to have questions, Q&A from the public, present here in the hall or joining us over Zoom. And we always encourage participation, active participation, to advocate for policy reforms. Dr. Ishaq, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this generous introduction. Thank you to the Citizen Foundation for such a fascinating series of discussion, on the heart of the issues in Lebanon, of the challenges. Sorry not to be with you. I wish I was with you. I see from your long coffee break that you're having a good time meeting in face-to-face, and I see many friends also among the participants. So engineering the economy, this is a big topic. I just want to throw in some ideas to try to take a back seat a little bit, try to shape a bit of a strategic discussion about the choices that Lebanon may have for the future. And very much building on what Mr. Jmayil, Mr. Saadi, Damien, and Soha already put on the table. There is already a lot on the table. How can we kind of intellectualize a little bit those choices and take the opportunity of the fact that we have to literally rebuild the economy from scratch to, for once, think harder about what should our future economy ideally look like. So there is a broad agreement now, it seems to me, certainly in this room, that we need a vision now for the future. Not ter'ia, as Dr. Saadi said, but a serious vision. That vision needs to be convincing. It needs to be convincing, partly because, for too long, certainly since the end of the Civil War, the politics has dictated what kind of economy we could have. And for the next phase, we need a very strong vision so that people get convinced to change the politics so it adapts to the economic potential of the country. It allows the country to make good on its potential. Governance needs to actually adapt to the economic potential. So we need a clear vision to have a better feel for this governance, but also so that we also understand the priorities of policy, what is more important than other, as opposed to this huge list that, you know, the World Bank or consultant can give us of the 300 things that we need to do to go to Norway. You know, strategically, what are the most important policies that can generate momentum and improvement that would lead us to this vision? And it's difficult to talk about vision because one can simply fantasize and be fanciful. So how to find a method to come up with a realistic vision that is grounded in history, in culture, and in the people and in the environment where we are. So that's the kind of questions we are now considering. It very much builds on the notion that the old model post-Civil War is dead and cannot be revived. This model built on hot money, on real estate, on construction, on non-tradable, on consumption. And I think we're all convinced that what is needed for the future is a productive economy built where the main engine is export. You know, for a small economy as Lebanon is, export is crucial. And we know that this is possible. You know, in the history of Lebanon, when we think of the country, it's a poor country. You know, it had period with famine, it had difficult period, it's a country of immigration, but it did have, in the recent past, at least 2 economic booms built on productivity, innovation, and export. And this is the Mulberry silk episode of the late 19th century, which, you know, started building some wealth in the country. And then the second one, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the roaring growth, which had to do with production, with Arab entrepreneurs coming to Lebanon because of its liberalism, its freedom, its stability, and also because of the institutional policies and construction of the Shihabist areas that build really the institutions of the states and allowed this growth to continue. So this reminds us that, you know, for that vision to work, we will need a whole set of policies. We need the right macroeconomic framework, a framework that is oriented towards growth, which means with a competitive, flexible exchange rate, with access to finance, with the right infrastructure, and we can develop that. But also that we need to think of the what and the how. An important element, I think, in this thinking is to get an order of magnitudes. So, you know, for a small open economy, exports need to be around 50% of GDP, or let me say at least 50% of GDP. So let's just play the numbers a little bit to get a sense of magnitudes. If we want to get back to our level of income before the crisis, $50–60 billion of GDP, this means we need exports of, let's say, $30 billion. It's not huge. It's feasible. It's if you think of our top Lebanese companies in the diaspora, it's 10 to 20 Murex or the transportation group in Marseille. So it's not huge, but it is much more than what we have today. Today, exports of goods and services, you know, including tourism, are probably around 5–6 billion. So it's 5 times more. 5 times more. It means we need growth, not just to ignite growth, but to sustain it for 1 or 2 generations. So the model needs to be a model that is sustainable, that can continue for a long time. it's not a jump that will take us back to where we were. It's not a jump that would allow Lebanon to be what it can be. It's a movement over 20 years, over 1 or 2 generations. So sustainability is extremely central. The other 2 questions I want to put on the table is the what and the how. Now, the what, it would be good to build on our comparative advantages. With the Shar'a group, we had a very useful exercise where we spoke with many entrepreneurs, many of which are in the room, to try to figure out what are the comparative advantages of Lebanon. And what came out strongly is things we've talked about already in the previous session: skills, the education, the entrepreneurship and the innovation, what economic liberties have given to the ethos of the Lebanese, the culture, the cultural content, what comes from the Nahda, the language, the music, the design, what makes the Lebanese brands, the connections to the world and to the diaspora, the environment of the country, nature, the beauty of the place that makes it special. So these are the comparative advantages. And I think a big issue for us is to figure out what this means for the coming 20 years. And one proposition I would put on the table is that it's not manufacturing, it's services. Our strategic goal should be to go towards services and not manufacturing. So towards, if you like, a Costa Rica model and not the Bangladesh model. So I, for example, Mr. Ismail, vision of a car factory in Tripoli. For various reasons. I mean, labor is not cheap, like others have said, and this is bad for the environment, it could be bad for health, but also we're in an age of robotization. China is the factory of the world. Manufacturing exports are not sectors that are growing, they're shrinking. We are at an era of deglobalization, really. What is growing fastest in international trade are services, actually. Services, and because we are in the era of digitalization, of the communication revolution, and so and this is, I mean, the way the world is going is actually very favorable to the comparative advantages of Lebanon. Never been a manufacturing hub, but we could actually dream of being a service hub. Services exported through digital communication means. We could be selling in the region and in the world accounting services, agriculture, education, health, legal services, advertising, distribution, e-commerce, all kinds of things that these could be. We could imagine creating, if you like, a virtual type of Dubai where high salaries, you attract talent with a promise of good living in nature, good living in terms of culture, in terms of liberties. In a way, if you like, the future could be based on a digital Nahda type, where design, or a Nahda on steroid, where culture is really exported. A big opportunity is in the Arab world, by the way. I mean, the Arab population is about 5% of global population. And what you look at the World Wide Web content, only 1% is in Arabic. So there's a huge space for expansion there. So I think this is one issue. Of course, there will be a role for agriculture and craft, especially, as Soha and Riyadh have described, especially the high value type that is branded to the diaspora, this organic agribusiness. And in manufacturing, also, as Mr. Ismail said, there are high-tech niches Lebanon has been good at that can continue and provide some diversity. So about the how, the sustaining, I think, is very important. And I would put perhaps four issues on the table to think about as we want to focus on how to flesh out this model. This first an issue about liberalism versus states. And liberalism, you know, Michel Chihau maybe was wrong or maybe he was right for his time, but Lebanon cannot be any more a commercial hub. But certainly he was right on liberalism. It is very much in the Lebanese culture, this economic freedom, and this needs to continue. But this doesn't deny at all the role of the state, quite the opposite. Our system right now is anything but liberal. It is monopolized, it is corrupt, and it does not favor competition or entrepreneurship. What you need is a much stronger role for the state in avoiding exploitation, in protecting nature, in preventing monopolies, and in offering services. Of course, education is key. Many people have already stressed it, and we are at risk of losing education excellence, which is at the heart of the comparative advantage. So a much better balance between liberalism of this and the state is one dimension. The other dimension is inequality. The country is right now extremely unequal, among the most unequal in the world. The kind of model that I've talked about would use a diversity of skills, from low to high skills. And so in a way, it fosters inclusive growth, and that's a good basis. But then it has to allow for social mobility, and services and education is their key. And it has to protect the labor market also. There's no question that there's a risk of excess migration, for example, in low skills. And what you need is to move towards middle and high skills. But perhaps most importantly, I would say the environment and decentralization can fit centrally in this model. The environment is what would attract people, and decentralization is what would allow centers of growth to compete against each other across the country. I mean, basically, this is a model where you have small communities that are connected to the world, that attract talent from the diaspora and from elsewhere to produce services to the world in a clean and beautiful environment. So I will stop that, and I would simply conclude by saying it is a good time to be dreaming about the future, and let's try to figure out a little bit. Let's try to sharpen the debate around a few issues, so that we use the opportunity of recreating the model to create the right model for the century in which we live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diwan, for your special intervention. And it's now time to listen to Dr. Harake and his analysis to the proposition of Dr. Diwan. Dr. Harake, the floor is yours. The online floor is yours.
So, hello again, everyone. Just to begin by thanking the Citizen Foundation, Lebanese Citizen Foundation, for organizing this event and hosting me. With the World Bank, we've collaborated with the foundation previously or recently with the Lebanon Public Finance Review. So we're happy to continue this collaboration through this event. Just to huge congratulations to Dr. Diwan on a very timely perspective on growth. I think this is a short note, as I received it. This is a short note meant to incentivize the discussion on a very strategic topic here. The discourse in the country has been highly focused on macro stability, which remains a prior action. in the Lebanon episode, and highly overdue. But the growth story is the real recovery story in the end. Macroeconomic stabilization achieves exactly that: stabilization, certainty, some credibility, visibility. But the recovery comes from Lebanon's growth story, and this is, and I would go beyond, and it's not a dream. I think the note is well pivoted in the Lebanon experience, and nobody is more an expert on that than Dr. Diwan. And lays out, I mean, we always hear productive, non-productive. It lays out the narrative very succinctly. It takes Lebanon's comparative advantages, and here maybe there'll be different views on that, but certainly some of the consensus around these advantages lays out targets and objectives, realistic targets and objectives per the narrative listed, and links again to the macroeconomic fundamentals, right? So it is consistent in the sense that, you know, all these components had to fit in consistently, and macroeconomics also comes in from the growth angle as well as from the stabilization angle in the manner that was explained by Dr. Ishaq. Conceptually, if I may, as I understood it, as I saw it, it takes us back to the drawing boards, very necessary at this point, because as well articulated, the post-Civil War growth model is dead, never to come back. So the pre-2019 economic fundamentals will not come back, no matter how much we hope that they would. It presents, it's heavy on consistency as well. It's one thing to do, it's another to fit consistently with the macroeconomics, with the politics, with the comparative advantage. So it's heavy on consistency as well, and that's key to success of any idea. And again, conceptually, and it pivots to Lebanon's experience, both its failures and its successes, as seen by the author, but definitely an important angle, because if you purely link to global experiences, you would leave a big gap there. Now, it's difficult to add the value. It's difficult to present relevant ideas in addition to what the note presents. I will try. Again, it's a short note, so it's not meant to be inclusive of all or comprehensive of all topics. It's not meant to be heavily analytical. It's more a strategic piece, and it does achieve that purpose. But if I may introduce a couple of angles here, and it's just to help us think through. And we've been at the World Bank. We've been trying to pivot towards the growth story. I mean, we've been doing a lot of macro and macro financial monitoring and analysis and the such, and we're trying to see when is the best opportunity to pivot to a growth story. And it is of course part of the bank mandate here, but as important determinants or important factors here would be some visibility, some stability, some certainty at two levels, right? The political scene, which is, we're not going to discuss heavily here, but definitely this is the environment in which the economy and any growth model would fit in. So no economy is isolated from its political realm, but at the same time as well, purely macroeconomics. The macroeconomics that we all feel and see now determine the resources the country has for its growth prospects. Sadly, with time, these resources are diminishing. So you have less and less to work with to build on a growth vision, to take it from a vision stage to a more realistic implementation stage. So the macroeconomy is relevant at the beginning and is relevant in its consistency component of the growth model, and we do not know what currency Lebanon will be using. We would like it to have the flexibility that allows it the competitiveness in order to export, current default path, sadly, is in the other trajectory. It's a de facto dollarization, for example, right? So the growth story would differ if we end up a de facto dollar. We are currently de facto, but if we cannot get out of it, the growth story might differ at that level. Of course, the human capital left in the country to carry on and implement this growth story is currently also on a negative dynamic, and that is the core essence of the growth model, or the resources for your growth model. So that we also don't know where that is ending. So not to stress that, and not to depress everyone, but it is important to recognize the country is actually on a transition. So gravity is working quite heavily here. The transition is likely, although we don't know where the country will end up, but is likely to make Lebanon look as different to before the crisis as it was after the civil war to pre-civil war, right? So and we can go back and collect some memories on our work in the post-civil war period, whether sectorally or whether the growth model. And there was a reason why things weren't working as they were being advanced. It's just the political economy of the post-civil war Lebanon was quite different. And we were imagining things potentially for what Lebanon was pre-civil war. So both in its economic location regionally and its resources available locally to implement these growth models. And that didn't work over 15 years. Instead, money was being made heavily. There was a lot of wealth, I wouldn't say created, I would say diverted, but there was a lot of wealth circulating in the economy based on a completely different model. Of course, eventually it burst and it has its own inconsistencies within it, but that lasted for a long time as well. So and what we're likely to have is probably a similarly different Lebanon. So Lebanon is changed permanently as the Lebanon we've known in the post-civil war period, and maybe this is some of this or a good part of it is welcome. And it has gotten even much further from the pre-civil war period. So do we want to maybe challenge our notions of what is the comparative advantage of Lebanon? What are the comparative advantages of Lebanon? And just to noting the time limit here. And here, of course, known by all, linkages to the region, economic linkages to the region. Just like the economy cannot be outside of its political realm, it cannot be outside of its geo-economic realm. So not just applicable in the Lebanon case, but in the other case. So what are the envisioned? And of course, the discourse is quite divisive in the country. What are the linkages to the countries in the region? Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Jordan, for example. And where does Lebanon fit here, both as a competitor or as a complementary, or where does Lebanon fit in the supply chain here? Too much focus, of course, GCC will remain important for Lebanon. Tourism will remain important. These types of flows will remain important. One has to question on the over-dependence on the linkages maybe to the GCC, just because GCC is not interested in that anymore. It doesn't look like it's interested in that type of a relationship anymore. And B, I mean, the whole geo-economy has changed as well. So something to, and again, key determinants in Lebanon's growth model. Maybe if I have some constructive critique here. I don't know. I got the impression that the technology factor and the high competitive factor can skip over very classical and very traditional infrastructure built, whether political or economic, or actual physical infrastructure built across the region. Lastly, I welcome the discussion on and maybe, I don't know finally, but at this level, welcome the discussion on the liberal model. And this can be taken from a global perspective. Globally, this model has changed as well. The sort of neoliberal model of the 1990s and early 2000s has also, one can also say that most countries have moved on from that to some extent. I think at the operational level, we still have challenges how to translate this expanded intellectual space where we can talk about models coming from the East, which is really a mixed model. And many view that as really the only recent success story in development. Again, not in wealth creation, in development, a much more comprehensive factor here where you lift masses up from poverty. So how do you bring that in, right? I don't know if we can pivot romantically, continue to pivot romantically to a liberal model where globally it has moved. And in the Lebanon case, and maybe this is where I might have something specific here to
Dr.
not to disagree on.
Dr. Harake, not to interrupt you, but we need to give time also for the presence to ask questions. So if we can still have one.
I will conclude right now. I will conclude right now. So the failures we have seen also can be in the Lebanon model can be suggested that this is what the liberal model can ultimately lead to, right? This deregulation, the process of self-deregulation and lack of regulation, that might be the natural course of a heavily liberalized model. And again, we've seen that globally in 2008 global financial crisis. I'll stop here and happy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harake, for your analysis. And now it's time to have questions from the public. I see a lot of raised hands, so if we can.
Hello, Ishaq. Thank you for being with us. It's always a pleasure to see you, even remotely. Thank you, Wissam, for this frank and candid presentation. I remember that the last time Wissam Harake spoke at USG, it was a few months before the 2019 uprising. We had organized also a very big conference about the McKinsey report and about CEDR, and you were also one of the few among the experts who warned that what was being done at the time was certainly not enough to prevent the upcoming collapse. And I also remember at the same panel, I think economist Ali Mbayid, who said that McKinsey and CEDR look like déjà vu, it's incomplete, it's ignoring the elephant in the living room, which is elite capture, patronage, massive corruption, sectarianism, lack of sovereignty, etc. So thank you both for speaking so candidly. This was one of the most interesting panels in the last couple of days. I have a question for Ishaq. You were perfectly spot on in what you said about Michel Chiha. He was prophetic about many issues, about Palestine. His views on the compatibility between liberalism and the Lebanese temper were also right. But today, in retrospect, we can no longer see Lebanon as playing the role that Chiha had envisioned as a bridge between East and West. We have been superseded by Dubai and many others. And just like, Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, said that today's neoliberalism has nothing to do with what Adam Smith had in mind, we could say that today's Lebanese economy has not a lot to do with Michel Chiha's view. So what you did today is brilliantly debunk the idea that Lebanon remains a free market liberal economy. You correctly reminded the audience that our economy is mostly controlled by cartels and monopolies, and that the state still has an important role to play in order for us to reach a genuinely free economy. I'm directing this question to you because Wissam is still with the World Bank. You have worked with the World Bank and with international institutions. They have engaged in a lot of self-criticism and soul-searching in the 1990s. They have studied their experiences in Latin America and in other places. Do you think it is enough? Do you think today institutions like the World Bank and the IMF are playing a positive role in Lebanon? I am one of those who think that when we are faced with such a ruling kleptocracy, we should rely on institutions like the IMF because they are often more progressive or at least more transparent with clearer criteria than what we are accustomed to. So having worked with these institutions in the past, to what extent do you think Lebanon should give them credence and work with them to get out of this current crisis? Thank you both.
Dr. Diwan?
Do you want me to answer? Okay. Thank you, Karim, and thank you, Wissam. On Michel Chiha, you know, as I said, when you develop a vision, the big question is you have too many degrees of freedom. So what do you rely on? So in my little note, I chose to rely on Michel Chiha's liberalism, on Shihab building of the state to regulate this capitalism. On the Nahda as kind of the driver of kind of the new Lebanese brand that is based on culture, and also on Antonius Shaheen, which I think is really a root of this yearning for equality and with the peasant reform, but also the union movement of the 60s and the 70s that was really broken by the ruling regime as a condition for the kind of governance system in which we live, and that needs to be rehabilitated. So I think this together provides us with a historical basis for the kind of vision that I'm putting forth here. Now, in terms of the role of the World Bank and the IMF, there is a interesting evaluation by the IMF department of their policies, adjustment policies in the world and in the region that just came a few months ago. And they recognize that being totally unable to drive economic growth. You know, they're good at, they come to a place that is bankrupt and they provide a little bit of finance and discipline for the country to tighten its belt and stabilize the situation. But in most cases, you don't see growth after. And they recognize that. And they say there's no substitute really for a national plan. You need a national plan. National politics is crucial. The national vision is absolutely crucial. So they can play a certain role. They are a tool, but they cannot substitute for a national vision, for national politics. And I think what this conference is doing is really sounding the alarm and telling the people, the polity, the population that there is no substitute for a political process that figures out where we want to be, given our history, given our culture, given our assets and our liabilities, and then hard work at a local level in order to make this happen. Face reality, face the tough reality, make choices, and adapt your governance system to that. So, in a way, I'm thinking of this vision exercise, this talk about the vision, not necessarily as a plan that we would follow, but as a political tool. This is a political tool to figure out where we could be if we were governed differently, so that we can actually be convinced to put more effort to change reality and get closer to the potential.
Thank you. Other question, please, I would like to remind everyone, let's have short, direct questions for the sake of time and the profit for the session. So, yes.
Thank you, Ishaq. Mohammed Faour from AUB. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation, much timely. One note, though, is that when we talk about the general discourse, we focus primarily on the financial stabilization aspect, which is the way it has been pitched is more of a backward-looking exercise. Losses have been allocated, we need to distribute these losses, and that's very true. And you add this angle, you amongst others, that, okay, we need to have also a forward-looking exercise, a much-needed forward-looking exercise, which is, okay, how can we get to a point where we realize growth rates of 5 to 7% at the very least? So the question is, now, the way things are being portrayed is as if both of these, the loss allocation exercise, which seems to be primarily a backward-looking exercise, and what kind of economy we want, which is more of a forward-looking exercise, as if they're two distinct things. And then comes the question of, okay, how can we bridge those two together? In the sense that the loss allocation exercise, which is very necessary, entails a massive, I wouldn't say destruction of wealth because the wealth has been destroyed anyways, but an acknowledgement of the massive wealth destruction, whereas on the other hand, the more forward-looking economic aspect is about how can we regenerate wealth on aggregate. And because this loss allocation exercise entails massive sacrifices, for people to buy into these sacrifices, you need that element which is more forward-looking, i.e. that, well, yes, sacrifices are needed. However, these sacrifices are precisely so that we could get to that point. And this is where you talk about the economic vision being a political tool comes into play, that it gives, it enables, it somewhat makes it easier for people to buy into the much necessary sacrifices of the loss allocation exercise. And that's the only comment I had. Thank you very much.
Dr. Diwan?
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. This is really very useful, I think, comment that you put on the table. You know, it makes me think of Nelson Mandela when he came out of jail. And it's the most unequal society. And, you know, he represents the 80% of the population that is extremely poor in this very unequal society. It would take 2-3 generations at least of good schooling and access to market and less discrimination to bridge that gap. And yet he manages to promote the idea of let's not destroy everything. Let's use our assets and rehabilitate them, and let's progressively move over 2-3 generations to where we want to be, to that vision that he puts on the table. It's amazing, and it's built on exactly what you're talking about, confidence in the future. How do you rebuild trust so that actually people are willing to accept the difficult situation in which they are, and maintain stability and work hard over years to reach the potential? I think it definitely takes confidence in the future, and it takes a process of rebuilding trust gradually, because it's all about solving coordination issues at all kind of level for the public good. And so you need to go back and, you know, maybe the big shareholders of banks would accept, how would they accept their losses? Basically, they have to think that their kids would do much better in an economy that has hope, that is growing in a good way, in an exciting way, and their kids will convince them that, you know, stop holding this country hostage to short-term loss. You know, let's instead dream about an exciting future. So yeah, the element of confidence is crucial to make stabilization possible.
Thank you, Dr. Diwan. One last question before closing the topic. Any other question from the audience?
Wissam mentioned the Lebanese model. Dr. Diwan, you mentioned trade in services versus trade in goods. Firstly, in the division between trade in services and trade of goods, where do you see the ideal, how much trade in services versus trade in goods and exports could Lebanon aspire to achieve over, let's say, the next 3 years? Could you plot a map on that? And secondly, as the Lebanese model, one of my long-term agonies in Lebanon has been that much of economic views have been imported into this country. And if I want to remember a conversation with an economist who extrapolates a Lebanese model versus salt water and seawater and whatever you have in Europe as economic schools, I'm at a loss. So could you write up a Lebanon model of economic insight based on the experience of the last 30 years and even the far back experience going back to what Dr. Fadi was referring to, namely this integrated trade and manufacturing paradigm of the Phoenicians, mythical or not, but the Murex and everything else. Could we have a model how Lebanon can show the world to be a better economy from a small country rather than from the American behemoths? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting that you've said Phoenicians and Murex, because the new Murex, actually, very successful firm, produced software for the financial sector worldwide, not just in the region. And it would take Lebanon 10 Murex situated in Lebanon to achieve the 30 billion target that I spoke about. So we do live in a world where it is actually services rather than the movement of people that are driving international trade. They are growing at 25% a year now, and this is what's being added to value chains. That there is a digital and communication revolution that is starting to sweep through the world. So if we look, I will not map these things at this stage. We're just discussing concepts, but I'm quite convinced that this is where the world is going, and I would argue that this is, if Lebanon has to choose strategically, this is what it wants to choose. This is not a dream. We see seeds of what I'm talking about. We see a lot of small firms in Lebanon, and Rami is an example, that have Murex and many others that are actually exporting services. The problem is that they're exporting themselves also to Dubai. What I'm talking about is actually having a virtual Dubai in Lebanon. And instead of attracting consultants from all over the world at very high rate to live in air-conditioned towers in the middle of the desert, beautiful Dubai, it's a completely a real place with a real culture, with real nature, in a decentralized way to produce services. A vision is perhaps too early, map it exactly, but one that is feasible and that is very coherent with the way the world is going. It also transcends a little bit the region. I mean, it is not outside the region because there is a lot of demand in the region and in the GCC in particular for this kind of services, as opposed to people, because migration is not, given Saudization goals, is not the future anymore. But there is a need, but it transcends the region. I mean, the web takes you anywhere in the world, and especially where there is a Lebanese diaspora that can act as your agent, as your consumers, as your producers. The diaspora can oscillate around Lebanon and give us a little bit of a global Lebanon that we already have to some extent, with people coming back in or leaving and circulating, if you like, around the world, but using Lebanon as a base also for education, for health, for marriage, for you know, what have you, retirement. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Diwan. I would like to tell everyone that our forum is running live over Facebook and YouTube for your friends or anyone who would like to join online virtually. And as well, all the papers presented by our authors will be posted over the website of the Lebanese Citizen Foundation, so we can go over the website, comment, interact as usual. Thank you, Dr. Diwan. Thank you, Dr. Harake, for this enriching topic. And we'll move immediately to our fourth topic to close the third panel, Re-engineering the Economy. The fourth and last topic in this panel is the future of the financial sector by Mr. Jean Riesche. Mr. Riesche is a certified director from the INSEAD's International Directors Program. He's the chairman and CEO of Financial Funds Advisor, FFA Private Bank SAL in Lebanon, as well as FFA Private Bank in Dubai. Previous holder of key positions in the French banking sector between 1985 and 1994, member of Human Rights Watch Beirut Committee, board member of the Lebanese American Chamber of Commerce, and board member of Kulluna Irada, an advocacy group for political and economic reforms in Lebanon. Allow me as well to welcome over Zoom Mr. Eli Zaja. Mr. Zaja is the head of Equity Derivative Solutions, HSBC Dubai. He started his career in global markets in 2003, and he joined the Equity Derivative Trading Desk at Société Générale Paris in 2004. He moved to HSBC, where he participated in founding the Equity Structured Products activity. And from Paris, he co-developed the equity derivatives business, offering financial solutions for private banking, retail and institutional clients in Europe and Middle East in 2010. He was appointed head of the Equity Derivative Structuring Desk in Paris, and during the last 10 years, he helped develop the equity structured product activity within HSBC with its 4 international hubs to run the actively globally. Today, HSBC is a Tier 1 player in the equity derivatives business with a recognized franchise in US, Europe, and Asia. Early 2022, he moved to Dubai to develop and grow equity derivative solutions activity in the Middle East. He received his diploma from Grande École from ESCP Business School in France and the civil engineering diploma from Azib Beirut. Mr. Jaja will be discussing Mr. Riesche's paper titled The Future of the Financial Sector. Mr. Jaja, can you confirm you are hearing us over Zoom?
Do you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much and welcome. So, Dr.
Sorry
Riesche,
for this long introduction. No?
Okay. Yes, we are able to hear you now. Thank you. Mr. Riesche, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't know, the bio is a bit maybe outdated. And as I have colleagues here, my alma mater is HEC Paris.
Okay.
So,
thank you for mentioning.
I'm a proud ex-HEC like Alain and others. Listen, the title of my intervention is Lebanon Banking Sector After the Collapse, the Rebirth. But it's the rebirth, but it's wishful thinking, and I'll tell you why. But still, we need to talk about it. Dr. Jmail, Fadi Jmail, Dr. Saade, Ms. Frame, they all said something very interesting. They said we should stop talking and start acting. In the financial sector, we would say we should stop talking bullshit and start acting. I have 3 parts. One, we need to talk about what went wrong and why. Second part is there are losses, how to deal with losses. And the third part is what is the future? What is the best future, hopefully, but I'm not convinced anything good will happen. So how and why did the Lebanese banking sector collapse? I don't know how to use these things. Can someone help me? Okay, it's here. Sorry. Okay, so here we are. So you all know about the country's twin deficit, okay, which was mainly financed by debt-creating flows, okay, which covered the cumulative current account deficits. Lack of vision, irresponsible fiscal management, and a rigid spending structure were, I'm not going to go into more details. So we had this fiscal deficit and this current account deficit that were huge for so many years, okay? And they were unsustainable. And they created a debt-thirsty state. And the external flows that we had were not invested in infrastructure, and that's terrible. We collapsed, and we spent huge amounts of money, and we have zero infrastructure. No development projects. We only financed high levels of state capture, as well as a rentier type of private sector activities. I think Ishaq Diwan talked about it. This was not a free capitalist economy, and I would like to start by saying that I'm not a red banker, I'm a capitalist. There's a difference between free economy and kleptocracy. This was a fraudulent model. It has lasted 30 years because there was shenanigans from the Lebanese banks and the central bank that helped it last so long. So the banking sector, in my opinion, had four sins. The first one is the size, an overblown size. If you look at the deposits in the banking sector, you see that we reached in starting 2017, 300% of the GDP, which makes no sense. If you compare it to other countries, yes, you have some financial centers that have more, but usually it's much less than this. I would like to say that the DFIs, of which some representatives are here, have contributed to this folly by relying on banks to finance the sectors they wanted to finance, which, by the way, caused huge losses for them. So I hope in the future, but we'll talk about it, there will be a different model. We can see here the figures of the number of branches, for example. It's another indicator that is interesting. Instead of reducing the number of branches, which was the trend all over the world, we continued creating new branches. And more importantly, the composition of those bank assets that represented 300% of the GDP, if you look at it, it's really scary. 60% with the central bank, 14% to the government. I think we're talking here dollar deposits, and only 25% to the private sector. The second sin is the incestuous relationships between the banking sector, BDL, and the Lebanese state that climaxed with the so-called financial engineering. Why so-called? Because it was not really science. It's not financial engineering. So, and here you see how the BDL share of incremental government debt, how high it is. how it increased over time. How the exposure of banks to BDL inflated banks' balance sheet and BDL balance sheet. And we're seeing here the liability side, but we don't know what assets we have to match those liabilities. In fact, we don't have assets. We have Lebanese liras. We'll talk about it maybe, but there are no assets to back those 100+ billion deposits supposedly in US dollars. Although the governor in a recent interview said that he had repaid all the dollar placed by banks with him, but there is an explanation if you want after the presentation. If somebody asks the question, I'll answer why he's saying that. Okay, all this had a crowding out effect, and created a rentier economy. Nobody would invest in anything anymore in Lebanon, in productive projects. Nobody could afford borrowing from the banks. No banks would be interested in lending any enterprise. I mean, that was crazy. All the banks became brokers for the central bank. Go get me deposits. I take them on my balance sheet. I pay you high interest rates. You pay the high interest rates. All that to maintain the stability of the Lebanese banks and to finance the state deficit. The third sin is the over-reliance on bank intermediation in financing the economy, which is against a trend worldwide, but it's not a new trend. It started in the 70s, in the 80s. We were the only country where there is no financial market, no capital markets, no disintermediation, no investment banking activities, no M&A, no nothing. You only had commercial banks attracting all people's savings to and by the way, risking those savings. So here you have the Beirut Stock Exchange as an example. Only 29 securities, 29. Daily averages of $3 million, market cap of 10 billion. That was nonsense. And even direct investments stalled completely, especially after 2016, because of the higher interest rates. I mean, we are a country that confused flows of money into bank deposits with FDIs. This is not an FDI, especially if you don't use those deposits. If the banking sector does not use those deposits to finance the private sector. The fourth sin that we had is a governance issue. The agencies that were in charge of regulating and supervising the financial markets. Okay, you have the BDL, which has as a mission to safeguard the monetary and economic stability, plus the soundness of the financial sector, plus the development of money and financial markets, plus development and regulations of the payment systems, etc. I mean, since BDL implemented its notorious monetary policy, which consisted in maintaining the peg at any cost, there was a conflict of interest. I mean, if you have to attract all deposits into your balance sheet to sustain the peg, you're not building a sound financial sector. Again, there were conflict of interest. For example, there is no checks and balances. Okay, it's a one-man show. We're not here to blame anybody, but anyone who has conflict of interest, even if there is no personal interest, they're just a trade-off to make between different missions. This person will fail because at one point it will make choices that are against the other missions that this person has. For example, Capital Market Authority. The mission of the Capital Market Authority is to develop the capital markets and to protect the investors, which is different from the mission of a central bank that would be to protect depositors and to ensure a stable monetary policy. And I'll give you a very simple example. Many Lebanese are invested in preferred shares, banks' preferred shares. They did so, they were pushed by banks to purchase them. There was a huge mis-selling. People did not understand what they were buying. They were told these are like deposits, you get a higher interest, and it's repaid after 5 years, and don't worry, etc. Where was the Capital Market Authority? Because it's the same people that were in charge of both entities, they made a trade-off. They said, we need this money to increase the capital adequacy ratios of banks, so let's turn a blind eye on the issue of suitability, of protection on investors, because we need to increase the capital of banks. That's one example. Okay?
Mr. Yeshe, just to remind you, we still have 3 minutes.
Okay. And now we have to deal with huge losses. You can see the presentation. I found this somewhere on social media, so I didn't create it. There are huge losses, especially with the central bank. The Eurobonds, thanks God, or I don't know if we need to be happy with this. It's only 9 to 10 billion with the banks, and few losses on the private banking, private sector. Now, I won't give you the solutions to deal with losses. I will just tell you that there are trade-offs. Shall we respect the hierarchy of claims and write off bank equity before we touch deposits? What will be the threshold for protecting deposits? 100,000, 500,000, 50,000? What will be the mechanism to offload bad debt and large deposits from the bank's balance sheet? Will the restructuring imply a reduction of the number of banks that will be authorized to continue functioning? And what will be the criteria? Will existing shareholders, board members, be required to contribute to the recapitalization of remaining banks? These are questions I will not answer, but at one point we will need to answer them. Now, let's go directly to the future of the Lebanese banking sector. One, we need to immunize the banking sector and BDL from the twin deficit problem. We need to immunize it from the state issues. We need to discipline the state. And we need to have this financial sector not to be accommodative. It's their problem. Second, we need to rebuild trust in the banking sector. What's going to be the size of banks' balance sheet? What is going to be the number of remaining banks? We need to leapfrog into digital banking, which will create a lot of issues with the existing banks' employees, because you're reducing the number of banks, of branches, but also you need to be more efficient, more competitive. What's going to be the BDL, the role of BDL? What will be the effect of foreign banks' entry, which we hope is going to happen? Today we have almost no foreign banks in Lebanon. How will we deal with the remittance inflows? Today, I'm sure that part of the remittance is not coming because there is no trust in the banking system. And what's the future of banking secrecy? In my opinion, it should be completely removed. I don't see any interest for Lebanon to have banking secrecy. The third point is disintermediation. We need to enhance capital markets. So if the state wants to borrow, the investors, professional investors could invest, but not depositors who have no clue through their deposits via the bank's balance sheet. We need more investment banking activities. We need more people who, by the way, most Lebanese companies are undercapitalized because banks, they don't give you capital or equity, they give you loans. So that would increase reinforce the capital structure of corporations. And we need to address the governance agency problem, probably by segregating the duties. We shouldn't have controlled by the same people a capital market authority, a monetary authority, a prudential authority. They have conflicting missions. They should be independent, so we create checks and balances. That was what I was talking about. Even anti-money laundering, also there is a conflict of interest. It should be totally segregated from other functions. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rieshe. We'd like now to welcome Mr. Eli Jaja over Zoom. Mr. Rieshe, you can have a seat, please.
Yeah, so do you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the LCF chairs and organizers for organizing and initiating this event and for hosting me. In 10 minutes time, we'll not have enough time to go deep into details, but I wish to cover mainly three messages. First, when I hear Mr. Rieshe presenting his paper, when he talks about future proposal for the future, I hear a hidden message in his paper, and I would like to highlight it. This hidden message is that yes, we can. Yes, we can rebuild the banking sector. Yes, we can develop some financial services done out of Lebanon. And on this front, I fully agree with Mr. Rieshe. Yes, we can. I believe for a long time we relied on a traditional banking sector where misgovernance led to a catastrophic situation. It is time to redesign the banking sector. It is time to diversify from this sector by developing wider financial solutions. Given the situation, and as a start, to develop financial services, no need to put very high expectations, like attracting the highest asset managers in the world, or be the hub of the Middle East for private banking firms, private equity firms, or be the center of excellence for fintech. We need to learn to be humble, to start small and grow smoothly but surely. What I'm saying is not a pure optimistic vision, in fact. In reality, it's already happening. There are a lot of small companies and even individuals based in rural areas that are providing softwares, apps, that are providing services, whether on accountancy, whether on translation, on paralegal, on research, translation, etc., for international companies already. What we need to do is to help these initiatives and help them to go from small scale to a country scale. Now, if I want to give another example, but on a bigger scale, I always like to share the example of Murex. Murex is not a financial institution, but Murex serves the top financial, gives a financial service for the top financial institutions in the world in 60 countries. It has 2,500 employees, where hundreds of them are based within Lebanon. So if we do some effort to duplicate the Dumeric's experience, we can have a solution on a big scale. Having said so, we shall be fully, how to say, aware that yes, the situation is difficult in Lebanon. But still, we have some enablers and we have some opportunities on which we can build on. And let me share some concrete examples. Leveraging, for example, on the good educational level and the attractive profiles of our young talents. There is a consultancy firm, one of among the top 5 in the world, who's willing to open a branch in the Middle East, not in Lebanon, but is considering to hire massively from Lebanon to work from Lebanon as an outsourcing. Leveraging on the diaspora network. This is what Dr. Diwan just named as the global Lebanon. So leveraging on the diaspora network, there is already a small social company in Lebanon who managed in 6 years' time to create jobs for 180 jobs, servicing 50 plus companies abroad. Leveraging on what's happening in the region, if I take the example mainly what's happening in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there's a massive transformation happening in these regions. They have a high and an ambitious capital market agenda. Just to give some figures, during the last 12 months, in each of these countries, there have been a new 10 listed companies that have been listed for a total size of $12 billion in each of these countries. If I share these figures, it's not to say that we can do the same, but just to say that if in the past Lebanese people used to target these countries to work in the construction, in the industrial, or in the oil fields, nowadays Lebanese people can target these countries to provide some financial services. And given the Lebanese pound devaluation, given the cost of living in Lebanon, providing these services from Lebanon can be very, very, very optimal. Having said so, we need to be conscious that yes, the Lebanese brand has suffered a lot, and we need to rebuild the value proposition of this brand. It will be a long road. It is a must. And the key word in this road is definitely confidence. So that leads me to the second message on how to rebuild confidence or how to rebuild trust, as Mr. Riashi called it. I fully agree with Mr. Riashi that strengthening monetary and prudential rules, segregations of responsibilities, and independent supervisions are definitely needed to rebuild trust. What I would add that maybe we need to go an extra mile. We need to change as well the persons behind those rules. And we need to make sure that we have in place persons who can execute and protect these rules. Rules alone are not enough. I'll take the example. Let's say if we take our political and financial governance and we put them into another country, do we have more confidence in this country? My guess would be no. And that's why, in fact, there is a French saying that I like a lot. Ce ne sont pas les lois qui font les hommes, ce sont quelques hommes qui font la loi. And yes, in this case, we definitely need the help of the experts to propose new laws, but we definitely need as well the help of the experts and mainly non-experts to bring the needed people behind these laws and as protectors for these laws. As a third and final message, it is in fact a thank you note and a congratulation message. But before that, let me go back to the period where everybody lived happily ever before. It is the period before October 2019. In fact, Mr. Yashi just described what happened. To summarize again, in fact, there is a system which was composed by the political body, the banks, and the central banks. And the business plan was so easy. The banks will attract some deposits. In 75% of the cases, these deposits are delivered to the central bank, and the central bank gives them to the state that make sure to spend them on operational stuff without any value added to the future. And by doing this, the profit was shared through the line. And this what cost us, on a best effort estimate, around $60 billion. The other side of the story, that part of these losses were somehow, whether intentionally or non-intentionally, were distributed to the population, whether by clientelism, whether to buy their votes, or whether to bring them comfort. But at least for this system, it brought stability for a long time of period. And during this period, there was, whether the gladiators or the victims were in a certain type of comfort zone. And within this period, with the exception of few groups, the large majority was not willing to listen to change, was not willing to bring the change. So within this period, a large majority, in fact, abandoned their duties, whether as governors, whether as experts, but mainly as citizens. This leads to, in fact, exactly where I would like to thank and congratulate Mr. Yashi and Lebanese Citizen Foundation for the work that you are doing. Because what you are doing, this is how you bring awareness and education to Lebanese people. This is how you bring experts to share information, to debate, and to make a decision well-based. And this is what a real citizen shall do, in fact. And the real change will happen the day where we all witness that we have a foundation of a Lebanese citizenship that we witness on a country scale. That was my message. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jaja, for your messages and analysis. Now it's time for questions. So please, I would like to remind everyone, we need to have short and direct questions in order to get as much as possible from the audience.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Yashi, thank you, Mr. Jaja. So, around 11 years ago in Iceland, the banking sector was pronounced too big to save as a result of the fact that during the financial crisis, the banking sector was just too large for the fiscal capacity of the country to actually bail out. Now, and as a result, the banks, an asset quality review was carried out for the banks. Banks were pronounced bankrupt as a result of that asset quality review, and things went on from there. Now, I happen to be of the belief, and I'm very happy to be proven wrong, is that if we carry out an asset quality review for the biggest 14 banks, in the best case scenario, 12 out of 14 would be announced insolvent. And I'm very happy to be proven wrong on this, to be very clear. So, my question is, given this belief that I have, are we dealing with an Iceland on steroids scenario, i.e. are we working on rebuilding a banking sector from scratch? Or can something be salvaged from whatever is left of the current banking sector? Because I tend to believe that it's more on the former rather than the latter. And this is about it. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. I don't know where you got your number, 12 out of 14. For me, it's 14 out of 14. The balance sheet, yeah, the balance sheet all look the same, which poses a more important question. Once you have determined that all the banks are insolvent, let's say all the major banks, you still need to build on them. So you need to repair the balance sheet, maybe through bail-in, and then through recapitalization. And that might be the criteria for the survival of banks or the not survival of other banks, which is if those banks can present a good business model, they will find, once you've done some kind of bail-in, but you need fresh injection of capital. My view is that this should be the criteria for the survival of banks. You, board, are you able to, we, the state, are going to do a bail-in. So we are the nice investment banker that is bring you money without any effort. But you need to bring, let's say we put the balance sheet at zero, okay? So no more losses, but no capital. You need to bring the capital. It was estimated, I think, at 600 million, the needs that you have today. No more. So it's feasible. It's probably on a few banks, and probably those few banks are going to be the ones who are able to convince new investors that it's worth it to invest in them. But that would mean that you don't have 60 banks. You have 4 or 3 or 5 banks competing for a small economy, which makes them viable because they won't have anymore the revenues from state debt and from BDL debt. So it's going to be only dealing with the private sector. So the criteria will not be who is insolvent. Everybody is insolvent. The criteria will be who is able to convince new investors to inject cash.
Thank you. Another question, Mr. Rieshe. What are your thoughts on the Lebanese secrecy law?
My thoughts is that it only serves and benefit money launderers, corrupt politicians and civil servants, and all of the Lebanese people when they do tax evasion. So this will help stop tax evasion, this will help stop money laundering, and this will help stop corruption. So yes, we need to remove it.
To reconsider this law.
Not reconsider.
Remove it completely.
Completely.
Okay. Yes, another question from the public, please.
Hello, thank you for the time. I would like to, in a previous session, we were praising the model of pre-Civil War. And that model was also, we had a booming banking sector. But don't you think that the problem now, the catalyst of the financial crisis now is an overvalued currency for 25 years or higher interest rate on dollars? Thank you.
Yes, of course. I mean, it goes together. I mean, maintaining the peg.
Do we want to back to the previous model of 1974? It was a booming banking sector as well, and banking secrecy.
No, we don't want.
Okay.
Because it's outdated anyways. I mean, Lijaja discussed many fintechs. I mean, there were many innovations in the world since the 1960s and 70s. It's over. I mean, the petrodollars flowing in and makes no sense anymore. No, of course, we don't want the same model.
And the overvalued currency was the catalyst of the crisis?
Yes, but it was not artificially overvalued. There were real inflows of money in the country. It's not that they maintained an overvalued currency by doing artificial measures. It's very different, by the way.
All right. Thank you.
Another question, do you think that the cryptocurrency can help Lebanese people in reaching more secure investment and bypassing the crumbling banking sector? And if yes, how?
Many will not be happy with my opinion here, so maybe I should abstain. But for me, cryptocurrency is a Ponzi scheme. It's worth nothing. It's worth nothing. Now, I'm not against blockchain, digital currencies, etc. But per se, cryptocurrencies, the way they are today, are, in French, we would say, un piège à con.
Mr. Dingisli, if you have any question or comment on the...
If I may add just on the cryptocurrency, because I know a lot of people who I know, and some of them are my friends, due to the Lebanese situation recently, they are looking for quick ways to gain money, like, I don't know, to double, to triple their investment in a few days' time. And that's why they so think a lot about the cryptocurrency. But I echo Mr. Yashi, in fact. We need to be very careful when we talk about this subject. I can give the example, like in 2 weeks' time, we saw a cryptocurrency that went from $120 into zero, literally zero, in 2 days' time. And here, sitting now in Dubai, a lot of family offices have lost hundreds of millions of dollars because they were highly exposed to this cryptocurrency.
Thank you, Mr. Jaja, for your answer. Mr.
Thank you.
Dingisley.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Jean Riachi and Mr. Jaja for really a very good, comprehensive view, and I share a lot of what has been said. First of all, I would like to answer one of your questions or comments on the role of the DFIs and at that time, and maybe also raise the question on the role of DFIs today and tomorrow. First of all, to put things into perspective, the cumulated operating assets of all all DFIs active in Lebanon is less than $1 billion. So it is not really very substantial in the overall amount that we're talking about. Having said that, we have, of course, our lessons to be learned from the Lebanese experience. What we did as far as EBRD is concerned, as we are the new kid on the block, the newcomer, we were only here since 2018, we wanted to have what we call a splash effect, meaning that we wanted to really contribute quickly and massively to the Lebanese economy, to the Lebanese development. And we thought, as we do in other countries, by the way, that going through financial intermediaries, whether banks or private equity funds, is a easy way of reaching that objective quickly and to plant a flag. But again, we have our lessons to be learned from this experience, and going forward, we would like to be part of this recovery, part potentially of a reconstruction, of a recapitalization of some of the banks, but for sure on a completely new basis, which is, I believe, the sense of this structural reform that the financial sector is in need for. A second point, quickly, we talked about the financial sector, but I want here to mention as well the non-banks financial sector. And I would like to think particularly of microfinance. And we know how microfinance played a key role in the financial inclusion in the country, in supporting entrepreneurs, in supporting smaller companies. And today this sector is also struggling, not to say dying. So maybe in our recommendations and our thoughts, we should also pay some attention to the non-banking financial sector, microfinance, for instance. And then one last comment, and maybe as I did in the past two panels, a cross-cutting themes. One point that we did not discuss a lot, I think, which is another elephant in the room, which is the electricity issue and the energy issue as a whole. We've talked about the engines for growth of the economy, but we cannot talk about engines and we cannot talk about growth without having the minimal infrastructure. And here, the energy, the electricity is probably one of the biggest impediments to any potential growth in Lebanon. And for that, I would like again and again to advocate for renewable energy, on which the EBRD has very strong ambitions. And we do believe that this is a clean, this is a cheap, and this is an abundant source of energy that we would like to leverage on for Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dingisley. Thank you, Mr. Riesche. Mr. Jaja, for your active participation. And I would call on stage Mr. Bifani to introduce our experts. Thank you very much.
Let me first thank very much all the contributors to a very nice panel this morning. starting with Khalil. Khalil, thank you very much for being with us during the 4 panels, for your amazing contribution. One of the nice memories that I keep is the campaign to win the bid of EBRD accession, and I'm very happy that it is here, alive and kicking, and still willing to do things for Lebanon. Yesterday, we had a panel on electricity, precisely renewable, and Roni Karam and Albert Al-Taif were actually going exactly your way. And I would also want to thank very much Riyadh, Soha, Fadi, Wissam, he just left us, Damien, Jean and Eli, obviously, and then Ishaq and Wissam, for very interesting speeches. And now it's my privilege to welcome a very special guest. The story of Iceland was very much in the discussion of the previous panel. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but the country had a banking sector of about 10 times GDP. The main 3 banks of Iceland were nationalized during the crisis. And today, to share a great experience with us, we have with us Dr. Svein Harald Øygard, who is a prominent economist, who has been the head of the Central Bank of Iceland, although he's from Norway. And that was in 2009. And he was, of course, in the midst of this very difficult crisis that was brilliantly managed. And I'm sure that we're going to hear about this experience in the coming minutes. I would also like to flag that he is the author of a book called The Combat Zone of Finance. I don't know if it's already available in English and Chinese. It is already available in English and Chinese. That was supposed to happen in 2020. And it's my mistake that I'm not sure about that yet. He previously worked for McKinsey. I'm going to leave the rest of the bio to our friend Johnny, but please give him a warm welcome. He's in Lebanon in very tough days, and we are very honored to have him with us. If I'm not wrong, also you've been involved in ministerial and parliamentarian works in your career. So we are very eager to listen to you. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Hard.
I'll go here, I will stand here.
If you like to walk.
Yeah, but before when you have an economic crisis, first you have to clean the floor, right? So I have to throw away this, the past, all the chairs, and then we go into the future. So, as said, I was the central bank governor of Iceland after the crash, which is a very important distinction. And I was called upon by the Icelandic government to help in the first part of the change process. Of course, first, as an author, I have to do some marketing. This is my brilliant book. It can be bought at Amazon. It's highly recommended. It's basically the story of how a country can go from the deepest crisis into transition, into the fastest recovery of all crisis nations. So I think it should be of some relevance, even though every story of every crisis, of course, is different. To place this a bit in context, as an economist, of course, I run the big database of all economic declines measured in US GDP, sort of converted, of the last 10 years, of all 196 countries in the world. So basically, this is the GDP decline, minus 54%, Macau, Libya, minus 53%, Venezuela, complete meltdown, -48, and Lebanon on a less so honorable fourth place as the deepest crisis measured by this metric. And then you go on with countries that you really not want to be compared with. And then I added as a reference Iceland, that had before I came, had a decline of 39% of GDP measured in dollar equivalent. And it was the largest decline, actually, of all countries globally after the global financial crisis. So this is a spaghetti chart. So basically, it shows, supposedly, what happened with the GDP of some of the crisis countries. And I'll go through a couple of the points. It's all indexed, and it's indexed up against the peak GDP value, which is then 100. So if I get the colors right, this is then Lebanon, the orange part, and it goes on, reaches 100, which is the peak GDP, and drops, as I just mentioned. And then, where do we go from there on? Of course, that's the topic after this discussion. Then you see a couple of examples. One example is the countries that do not recover. And why don't they recover? Well, basically because they end up in a systemic crisis. And the ultimate example there is actually one of the richest countries in the world in the 1930s that basically broke down the software of the economy by messing up the pricing system, plus sanctions and a lot of infighting, almost civil war, and then ended up bringing Venezuela from a prominent position among the richest countries in the world to a very horrendous situation as one of the poorest countries in South America. A European example is this one. Basically Greece going up and then peaking at close to the global before the global financial crisis. Then Greece crashed, wasn't able to solve its structural problems, believed that the outside world will help them, and ended up in a 10-year discussion on who should pay the bill, with the result that they didn't really address the underlying problems of the Greece economy. And where is Greece now? It's at half the value that it had pre-crisis. Then, of course, since I'm here, this is Iceland, climbed up to 2008, peaked, crashed almost 50%, and then climbed steadily over the coming years. Had a new decline post-COVID, before it then basically came back to a prominent position among one of the 10 richest countries of the world. Argentina, just to complete the story, ups and down and bumpy, but still almost making it. Ukraine, the pink, basically collapsed after the 2014 invasion by Russia, then steadily bringing everything back in order before they again were attacked by Russia, with the result the GDP decline. So if you want to look at cases, this is just a catalog of cases. It's an example of what goes wrong in countries that really don't address the key issues and what can be done if things are handled in a good way. Yeah. So just a few words about Iceland. It's not because it's a good parallel, but it's sort of some references here that are important. And of course, it is one of the points that I had. Iceland was also on the Imf program. A couple of you have mentioned it. Fewer than what I would thought, actually, given the importance that this will have in shaping the direction of your country. So I'm a bit surprised, actually, by that, to the degree that this hasn't reached the top of mind of such an insightful audience. That will change, believe me. So this is what shortly was happening in Iceland. Iceland attracted money from all over the world into a small country, smaller than Lebanon. I drew it a bit bigger here just to give the right size. And how did they do it? Basically, they went out in the international capital market and said, come with your money to Iceland and you get a slightly higher interest rates that you have in your home countries. So first they tapped into the European market, and then into the US market, and then the Asian markets. And this was largely financing from banks, international banks, that went to the 3 Icelandic banks. So the 3 Icelandic banks basically became some of the largest banks in the Nordic. So as mentioned here, I think the number I use is that the balance sheets of the banks ended up being 12 times the size of the GDP. So basically they beat the heck out of Lebanon that only got to 5. So there are basically people that have run a larger Ponzi schemes than yourself, and that basically made it. So the money went to Iceland, 12 times GDP. Simplistically, 7 times GDP went out again into the world. It was lended out by the 3 banks to international clients. 3 times GDP is a humongous amount of money. 3 years total income was basically distributed out into the Icelandic economy as loans to Icelandic companies and households that became the most indebted companies and households in the world as percent of GDP. And a lot of that was actually foreign currency loans, because the Icelandic currency rose and rose in value. So people thought it was very inexpensive to have a foreign currency loan up to a certain point of time. So the most indebted households and companies in the world, and the largest banking sector in the world. And the world has never ever seen something similar. To say it briefly. A bit different from here, at least from the last introduction. I learned that, okay, here was different. The Lebanese banks went out to the world and offered a high interest rates. The money came to Lebanon, and then it went into the local banks, and they sent it to the central bank. And the central bank basically ended up being, the bad guy in the history. And the central bank then sent on the money to the government in substitution for the government's inability to raise taxes from its people. And why couldn't it raise taxes? Well, most probably because of lack of political legitimacy. So the story then is a story of lack of political legitimacy, a desire to spend more money than you have, a government that runs a deficit, a central bank that pays for the deficit, the banks that provide the money to cover the deficit, the interest rates used as the tool to get the money, and the international sources of capital, and the poor Lebanese that have made their deposits being the ones that actually finances what's really rooted in the problems discussed yesterday, linked to lack of political legitimacy. This is just a 1 minute economic political analysis from me sitting here all day yesterday and today, trying to understand what the heck has been going on. So hopefully I got it reasonably right. Okay, back to Iceland. So this is what happened. So this is the total debt of Icelandic companies and households as percent of GDP. So basically, the money went into the country, into the banks, and it was then distributed out into the economy. As some economists in the room will know, when you inject this amount of money into the economy, you get a super boom. In the equity market, in the housing market, regarding unemployment, everyone thinks this is a really good ride. So who can you blame? Well, you can also blame the people, because the people had a really good time. And you can blame the policymakers, because it was a very convenient couple of years. But then, of course, like everything, nothing grows into heaven, not even debt. So at some point of time, the capital market says, okay, what's going on? They did not want to provide more capital to the Icelandic banks, as they didn't to Lebanon, and then everything crashed. In Iceland, everything crashed in a week, in October 2008. 90% of the banks went bankrupt. Unemployment went through the roof, and so on. But again, this is the interesting part of the story. You could also say, I guess, also equally interesting, this is the other part of the story, that they were able to get rid of the debt. So it's one thing is to get debt, that can be hard, but what's really difficult, of course, is to get rid of the debt. And maybe that's something where you also could learn from Iceland. But then you, of course, definitely need to read my book. Okay, so what happened in financial markets? Well, when money gets into the system, where the same money chases for the same targets, valuation goes through the roof. Property values, equity values, and so on. Hello? Yeah. So this is the evaluation of the Icelandic equity market. And as you can see, some people had a really good ride here. And I guess it goes under the embezzlement part, as mentioned in the presentation yesterday. Before the market firstly lost its trust here, then it came back, and then everything collapsed with a 95% reduction of equity values. The same happened to property values and so on. So what we saw in this tiny country was 3 of the largest defaults ever in the history of mankind. So this is on the left-hand side. These are all the defaults, bankruptcies, to put it that way, by companies that have been rated by one of the rating agencies, by Moody's. So basically on the top you have Lehman Brothers, as many have heard about, WorldCom, and on the 4th place, Kaupthing, one of the Icelandic banks. On 6th place, Glitnir, another Icelandic bank. And these are the bankruptcies in the global financial crisis. The 10 largest bankruptcies. And one Icelandic bank is on the 2nd place, one is in the 3rd place, and one in the 7th place. And I don't think any Lebanese banks will make it on any of this list, despite the magnitude of your crisis. And then, of course, also here, there were sort of riots in the street, and this is the flag of one of the banks being, basically demonstrators putting light to the flag. Another part here is also the default volumes. So these are the magnitude of the securities, basically debt obligations of these banks in the capital market that were defaulted. So it's $12 billion here, 18 here, and 20 here. So basically $50 billion is of defaulted bank debt in this structure. And this is what the capital market expected that they would get back, 3%. So basically, the day after the collapse, you could buy back the debt given to the banks for 3% of the face value. And yes, all these banks were restructured. Part of them went bankrupt, went into the bankruptcy process. The debt was bought by the hedge funds, and some were able to sell it not at 3%, but at 30%. So they made a 10 times return by being the vultures in this story. So to just wrap up quite quickly, this is some of the things that happened. 90% of the banking system collapsed in a week. The households and the companies went bankrupt, a large part of them. Half the companies in the countries went bankrupt, which I think is even worse than here. And that was caused given the high indebtedness and the high level of foreign currency loans among the debtors. The payments were basically, the central bank had to take over the credit card payments. The banks, when they collapsed, they get funding from the central bank, and then they eventually still collapse, and the central bank takes control of the assets. We were chased by 60 international creditors who had given money to the countries, and we ended up in a dispute with the UK and the Netherlands. And it went to the point where the UK basically prohibited transfer of funds to Iceland, but they had no law that could hinder it. So what did the UK did? Well, they basically had a list of countries to whom you could not transfer money, which included Al-Qaeda, Belarus, Burma, and so on. But they simply then put Iceland on the list of terror organizations to block any transfer of funds out from the UK to Iceland. So this is the central bank, the reception in the central bank before I came. No one had really told me that this is what would happen when I came, but still, we had to take it from there. Also here, in banking, there's also a question of legality, there's a question of politics, and there's a question of practices. And many will say that some of the practices in these banks were, so to say, well above on the other side. This is basically, in Iceland, all the bank secrecy laws were lifted post the collapse. So everything was made public. The entire loan book of the bank, the complete list of people that had borrowed money to the banks. I got a spreadsheet with 40,000 lines when I wrote my book, which is basically the list of all the creditors that have given money to the banks. But it also included the list of who had borrowed money from the banks and basically taken out money from the banks. And they hadn't done it as these guys up in the right-hand corner, the normal bank robbers. No, they had basically borrowed from themselves. So the bank owner had borrowed from their own bank. So this is the largest owner of Glitnir, one of the banks. This is his mother, this is his father, and this is his wife. So 4 of the 10 largest lenders in one of the 10 largest banks, 4 out of the 10 largest lenders in one of the 3 Icelandic banks, which were among the largest banks in the world, were basically the owner, his wife, his father, and his mother. And I don't think you have that in Lebanon, because here I think it went to the central bank. But who knows? You keep it secret while this was revealed. So what happened? Well, in Iceland, after the global financial crisis, the UK, Japan, and Korea jailed 0 bankers. The US, where the whole crisis originated, they jailed 1 banker. And little Iceland jailed 25 of the 47 bankers that were jailed globally after the financial crash. And this is the Icelandic jail. It's not a comfortable Mediterranean climate, that's for sure. Okay, let's get to the even more serious part. This guy, because he was in Iceland, when I came to Beirut, I think Sunday evening, I was actually quite pleased, or I don't know, surprised, because I saw you still had a McDonald's store on the corner. Well, what happened in Iceland was that pre-crisis, the currency, now all the students in macroeconomics have to follow here, because it's a good case example. So pre-crisis, the currency was strong because of the capital inflow. So basically, McDonald's could establish a franchise whereby they could import bread from Germany, meat from New Zealand, and so salad from UK, and then they could make it all in Iceland. Then, of course, when the economy crashed, the currency crashed, the McDonald's went out of business, which still hasn't happened in Lebanon. And it was all substituted by a new chain called Metro, basically with local meat, local bread, local salad, and that, of course, helped to reduce the import substitution and help to bring the macroeconomic conditions back in good order. So a lot is still to happen, I think, in Lebanon. So we also then had an IMF program, and I tried to summarize everything on 1 page. I won't go through the detail, but just show some points, because on the next page, I made a similar page for Lebanon. And my idea was that to focus the debate, it is important to really identify the few critical things that need to happen. And I must say, and I'm going to criticize this grouping a bit, because I've hardly seen ever such an unfocused group of people. All of you believe different things are the most important thing in the world. And you all believe that a state that hasn't been able to manage even the most simple things in a country of entrepreneurs now should be given the responsibility to bring things back in order, which sounds a bit puzzling to me. But I will leave that for the debate afterwards. Anyway, so we said that the macroeconomy had to be fixed, the monetary policy had to be fixed, the fiscal policy had to be brought in order, and of course the banks had to be restructured. And we put out a timeline saying that all this stuff should be done in 1.5 years. It's not really that conceptually difficult. You just need to decide and execute. take out the inflationary pressure, address the export challenge, re-establish stability on the exchange rate, solve the budget issues, negotiate the claims regarding the banks, refinancing banks. What you get, you get a fully operational banking system, you get clarity of state debt, and then you basically create a growth momentum for the country. So, looking at the IMF program, this is my one-pager for Lebanon. So, the same categories. It is more different than what you thought, but it is some of the main elements. There's something on the macroeconomic, something on the monetary policy, something on the way your budget is structured, and then, of course, something on the financial markets. I'll go through it in some detail, and then I will dwell on a couple of points in the next pages. So, on the macroeconomy, it was mentioned, twin deficits. Okay, so basically, Lebanon as a country spent more money on imports than you were able to earn on your export. And how do you close the gap? By more borrowing money. That's one of the two deficits. The second deficit, the government wasn't able to raise money, and the government normally just raise money in one way, by taxes. So the government was not able to tax the people in the room in a fair way that was sufficient to pay for the cost of running the government. Social schemes, corruption, all the other stuff that the governments had to spend money on. So there were the two twin deficits, and they were both covered by, in the same way, from what I understood, by basically more borrowing money from abroad and from Lebanese citizens. And that was done by high interest rates. So those two deficits have to be fixed. The first of them, the macro balance, has been touched upon earlier today. How do you fix it? Well, you fix it by reducing imports and increasing exports. And increasing exports means, of course, for example, more tourism. Reducing imports means import substitution. I haven't seen the numbers, but of course, as a country goes into contraction, as Lebanon, most often that reduces consumption dramatically, not least with what has happened to the currency. So I wouldn't be surprised if this actually has been fixed already, simply because of the status of the economy. And that was also what would happen in Iceland, but I'll get back to that. Then, on the fiscal policy, and I'll get back to the monetary policy, but on fiscal policy, of course, yeah, the second deficit also needs to disappear. And as touched upon yesterday, okay, that means a change tax reform. And of course, that has to be rooted in political legitimacy, because it's hard for a government that isn't legitimate to tax its people. So what do? They pretend. And how do they pretend? Well, by borrowing money from the central bank, or even worse, by printing a bit more money in the central bank than what's collected from the public. And if you print more money, that's basically a tax, but it's an inflation tax. And that's one of the other things that was happening in Lebanon. So, tax reform, increased import taxes, and spending cuts to the extent that's possible. And then, as IMF said, the government debt needs to be restructured, which basically means some people that have borrowed money to the government needs to forget about that money. And of course, you need to reform the state-owned enterprises, especially in energy, that's been running in a deficit. And then the banks, and I'll get back to the banks, they will need to be also restructured. 14 out of 14 banks was mentioned by the last speaker, scaling and so on. With that, you can get banks that support the domestic economy, which is what any economy needs to grow. You need to slash the public deficit to 4%, is what the IMF says. And then, last but not least, the monetary policy needs to be fixed. And what can you expect? Well, the first thing, the money printing, as I said, has to stop. Because if you print money, then you will have inflation. And if you get the inflation, then of course, at some point in time, it goes out of control. I think you have to expect high interest rates as part of it, and most probably, it's written a bit between the lines in the IMF paper, but there will be capital controls. So basically there will be limitations on the ability to exchange your local currency into foreign currency, and going to one currency rates. And then at a longer term, at some point of time, this whole thing needs to be rebased, which means either you get an inflation target, and if you get an inflation target, well, that has to be rooted in the stronger fundamentals. It has to be rooted most probably in an injection of capital, and kind of a political legitimacy. You can have a link to a currency, but of course that's only legitimate if you have all the things above. Or you can just scrap the whole local currency. There are countries who have done it. Montenegro in Europe uses the euro, and Ecuador in South America uses the dollar. And they basically forgot about the whole thing of having a currency. Again, a small country with entrepreneurs and a country that can't solve even the basic stuff. Yeah, can it even have a currency? Just to be provoking. Anyway, with this, as long as you have entrepreneurs, willingness to work, innovation, well, things can be solved. So then there are a couple of things to note along the way. In this recession, how do you avoid that everything stops? And I think one of you guys also made a reference this morning to the IMF program. And I think one thing you need to remember, the IMF program is not about the money. So there's an expectation that as part of the IMF program, they put $3 billion on the table. And there's a expectation that in addition, there are friendly countries, sponsors, or whatever, that will put additional money on the table. But here you will be disappointed. The money from the IMF is not money that's given for charity. It's basically, it's not even the carrot, it's the whip. It's the whip that forces a country to do what the country is obliged to do or should do in the view of IMF. So forget about the money. Remember the list that I just showed you, which is basically the wish list of IMF that will be forced down your throat, whether you like it or not, as long as this is the journey that you're embarking upon. And I had the pleasure in Iceland working with IMF, and I'll get back to that shortly. Anyway, how do you avoid the economy from stopping? There's one piece of good news, actually, is that when a country goes into recession, what people stop buying is so-called durable consumer goods, cars. And if you have no car manufacturing in Lebanon, I think you don't have, then, well, basically the reduction of this part of consumption won't harm your country. You basically export part of the recession. And that's a benefit of actually not having this kind of production. What people really need is food, is services, and that's bought locally, which will then reduce the impact on the local economy from the recession. So half the reduction in GDP in Iceland was basically covered by a reduction of imports. So the travel from Iceland abroad went down 70%. The camping in Iceland by Icelanders tripled. The only thing people bought more of imported goods was sewing machines, because everyone thought had to know how to make their own clothes. And then, of course, good news, the crisis hit in October 2008. In August 2009, 9 months later, there were born more Icelanders than ever before in the history of Iceland. So more people could help to pay the debt, basically. Or they just shut off the light and had to do what was free. Anyway, then there is, as I said, some import substitution and some export growth just based on the change of currency rates, and I think also that was touched upon this morning. There could be private funds that are frozen that you can reactivate and that can trigger new investments. You can mobilize private sector investment capacity. It has been mentioned, energy, renewable energy. that's the one sector where there are companies internationally willing to invest in, frankly, in almost any country. So if you really want to attract capital, it's the easiest arena where you can basically establish a policy and attract billions and billions of dollars of new investment that will help to solve energy security, that will create jobs, and that will also eventually improve the foreign direct investments. Yeah. Then, of course, on the government side, you can implement some measures now that have impact later, and so on and so on. So this fiscal adjustment, the external balance adjustment is fully possible, and the internal balance adjustment is also fully, but it takes a lot of dedication. Then you have currency control, and IMF has historically been against currency control, but in Iceland it was introduced, and that same scheme was introduced again in Argentina when Argentina got into a recent crisis. And it basically said that a wall is established in the financial market. You can go into the public kind of domain or to the central bank and get dollars or euros that's needed for imports of goods and services that are defined and certificate, but you cannot get it to move money abroad. And that's most probably what you will also see here in Lebanon shortly. Then I will spend a bit of time on bank and bank restructuring. This is my specialty. I'm a European champion in restructuring banks. I put 20 banks into bankruptcy, and they all reappeared with a bright new future. Anyway, so this is what a balance sheet of a bank normally looks like in different categories. So basically, on one side, it's what the bank owns. So the bank, when a bank gives a loan to a company, that loan is owned by, of course, by the bank. If the bank lends money to your house, that's also owned by the bank, and then the bank often sort of loans money to other financial players, also to other banks. And of course, in Lebanon, from what I understand from the last presentation, a large part of that has actually been that the banks have lended money to the government to pay for one of the twin deficits. So the bank's balance sheet basically consisted of these assets. Then it's what the bank owe, basically the claims or liabilities of the bank. One is in other countries, basically they actually have borrowed money from the central bank and not the opposite way around. Then you have the deposits from the customers, which of course is a liability of the bank, and market financing, which is basically that the banks goes to the market and borrows money in the market that's used to finance the bank. And as all the bright students know, these two lines needs to be of the same height. And then, as in another country, the little blue part on the bottom here is the equity, which is the kind of total net value of the bank. So that was a 2-minute lecture on banking. And of course, what's noteworthy is how tiny the buffer is for normal banks. And why is that? Well, that's basically because the size of the equity is a cost of the bank. But that also means that as soon as that little blue part on the bottom is lost, the bank is in default, which means that the bank has a horrendously small, limited buffer, which of course is one of the reasons why when a crisis occurs, banks are the ones that are hit. So, what is it that you need to do if you have a banking crisis and want to resolve it? Well, either you have to increase what the bank owns, or you have to decrease what it owes. And there's lots of things you can do as a regulator in these processes. So you can basically, the easiest part is you can inject more equity, right? So you just put in more money, and that solves the problem. But the blue one is so limited, so it doesn't really help. Then the government typically can inject more cash if it has money, but of course that's the problem here. The government doesn't have the money. Or the government, if it has other assets that it can basically put it into the bank, and with that refinance the bank. And that's often coupled to a split of the bank. Then on the other side, you can basically write off what the bank owes to others. You can just say basically, okay, we know that in principle the bank is obliged to pay you, but sorry, it won't pay. So the first thing to go is the equity. You write that off. And I guess a speaker mentioned yesterday that it might be that the equity is lost. Well, the equity is lost. End of story. The second thing that typically goes is a part of the market financing, where you basically say that, okay, dear Deutsche Bank, you have borrowed money to these banks or whatever, National Bank of Qatar or whatever, but that money isn't there anymore. So we have to take a haircut. And the third alternative, of course, is to go into deposit and basically declare that a part of the deposits is lost. And you can either just write it off completely, or you can say, you can convert that into equity, which basically means that instead of owning a deposit, whatever, $1,000 in deposit, you own $900 in deposit and $100 in shares in the new bank. And if you do that, given the size of the yellow one and the tininess of the blue one, it doesn't really take a lot to solve a banking crisis through these measures. Personally, I think people are far too afraid of these kind of mechanisms. It's much better to go in and say, sorry, you thought you had 100 in the bank, you don't have 100, you have 80, but you own 20% of the bank. Then, of course, all bankers needs to lose their right, and the banks can then reappear in a new structure. And if you do, then you actually can get robust banks over a weekend, if this is just done forcefully. That was done in Iceland. The new banks were created out of the old ones. Not a single dollar was injected, but because of this balance sheet restructuring, these banks ended up being the most solid banks in Europe. And they can basically finance the entire rebuilding of the Icelandic economy. This is complicated, so on this you have to read my book. Working with IMF, and I will just take this one more chart. Of course, the priority number one of IMF, and I think this is going to be more and more important for you as time goes forward, because then you will see how this thing plays out. So, of course, the main concern is to solve the global financial system, and it's to protect themselves, because they also end up being a creditor. And they will depend on these so-called sponsor countries. But my view, they are in general well-intended. So priority one is to save the world. Priority number two for them is to save the country in question. So don't start to imagine that they aren't well-intended. They have showed a readiness to put pressure on the private sector clients or creditors. That's what happened in Iceland. 30 creditors came into the room, and I complained to the IMF about the central bank governor, who was a piece of shit, i.e. me. And the IMF said, just forget it, go, leave the room. He's doing what we think we should do together. Yeah. There's a lot of processes and systems that you will get aware of. And then, of course, my criticism would be, I think, mentioned by one of you earlier today, they have insufficient focus on growth, on what comes next. They have insufficient focus on what can be done by using market tools and so on. And then, to end perfectly on time, I think the call to action for everyone in this room and outside the room is this small chart that basically is a reminder. One thing is how you are hit. That is, of course, important. But most important is how you recover. And there are stories of countries that are, this is what happened for a number of countries before and after the financial crisis. Index 100, GDP. The US had a small boom, then was hit by the global crisis that itself created, but then came into a quick growth trajectory. The EU had a bit stronger momentum pre-crisis, a stronger crash, had started on a good trajectory, and but then got the euro crisis, as we all remember, that basically led Europe as a whole to lose 2-3 years of growth, especially in Southern Europe, as they tried to sort it out. And then, for whatever it's worth, a small country, but still the largest crash, and then came back quite neatly. But then the one country that never was able to really fix the fundamentals, and still 20 years from now will fight with the creditors about who should carry the burden of the crisis that hit in 2009-8, namely one of the neighboring countries in the Mediterranean. So with that will be my final word of advice. Just get together, sort out what needs to get done, and get it done. Thanks for your attention.
Mr. Harold, we would like to thank you very, very much for this valuable presentation. And we can take, because we are running as usual out of time, we can take one question. If someone from the presence, no? No questions? Okay. One? Akhtar? Okay. Great. So more than one questions. So who would like to start?
Thank you, Svein, for the presentation. I think one nuance between your comparison between Lebanon and Iceland is, in Iceland's case, it was much easier to default on your banks. It was much easier to make the banks default on the creditors because they're foreign. Whereas in Lebanon's case, the creditors are Lebanese. So it's much easier to basically piss off the Dutch and British creditors over pissing off the Icelandic creditors. So let's say you were in a scenario similar to that of Lebanon, where actually your creditors are not Dutch, they're not British, but in fact they were Icelandic. How would you deal with such a scenario? What message would you tell to your Icelandic creditors? Thank you.
Yeah, firstly, there's another nuance that you didn't mention, and then it's who are the creditors? Because in Iceland it was private money to private companies. So basically, a German bank, Deutsche Bank, had borrowed money to Icelandic banks. And that's a commercial to commercial. And there are procedures for how to do it. I think in Lebanon it's a bit different because I think it's partially private to private, but also the government sort of is behind it, given the link to the central bank. But I think the answer isn't that different. In the end, there is a bill to be paid, right? And the bill is there. It's sort of, if you go to a restaurant and we have a nice dinner, and then we end up quarreling, and there's a bill to be paid, the bill doesn't get smaller if you beat up each other and ruin the restaurant, right? It's exactly the same for a country. There is a bill to be paid, and the bill is linked to the historic restructuring. We can hate it, and we can think it's unfair, but it has to be paid. And I think the fairest way to do it, in my view, and I know that's a provoking thought for many, would be to wipe out the equity of the bank owners to convert what needs to be converted of the claims on the banks, including deposits, and say, okay, we will give back in cash as much as we can, but whatever is in addition, well, that's equity. And if the value of the economy re-emerges, then the value of the equity will also re-emerge. And I think if it's done correctly, I think it's actually surprisingly how smooth such a conversion can be.
Thank you. Another question? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Orgard. If I'm in Lebanon and I want to buy your book, I cannot buy it because I don't have a credit card accepted on Amazon. My question is, if the regulators and the government is part of the system and in collusion with the bank owners, how do you deal with it?
There I will build on the last speaker. I think you have to separate the roles, right? You need to clarify the roles of the different participants in the kind of financial system. There needs to be a regulator, and the regulator should be independent of the central bank, and the regulator should only be focused on the integrity of the financial system. There needs to be a central bank with an independent central bank governor, and the central bank governor should be focused only on the stability of the monetary system. And there needs to be, of course, a government, and the government needs to be able to pay for its own activities. And if not, it either has to reduce its spend or increase its taxes. So there needs to be and lastly, of course, there needs to be bank owners that are credible bank owners and that are able to fulfill their role in a good way. So this clarity and transparency, I know it's easy to say, but again, that's the way to do it. And it's not really rocket science. There are small countries with relatively sophisticated financial industry that has done this, but of course it's a journey that you have to embark on.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the fascinating model you're proposing, which for application to the Lebanese economy. I have just one remark. This model is based on the assumption that politics is not playing any role in the reform. So, on the basis of what you have learned for the last couple of days here about Lebanese politics, would you be willing to introduce certain changes into your model? Maybe not right now, but in general. Thank you.
Mr. Harry, the microphone.
These elements that I outlined, right? This is the, how would I phrase it? This is the customary way to solve it, right? And if you want to solve it in a customary way, that will help to resolve things in a speedy manner, and that will reestablish your country and your economic system among the countries in the open market economy, well, this is what you have to do. There's no alternative. And that is irrespective of whatever politicians that are in power. And if the policy part of it isn't solved, well, then you end up with a lower blue line, right? So it's a call for action for everyone in this room.
Yes, Mr. Bifani.
Very quick ones, if you don't mind. First, how did you deal with the vulture funds? And second, but I know it's not really in the midst of the story, but what kind of safety nets were introduced to accompany the IMF program and the reforms you just highlighted? Safety nets for the people, for the most fragile parts of the economy.
Okay, so I love the vulture funds. They're just fantastic. And why is that? Well, because when everyone else gets scared and afraid and run away, they are the ones that reappear. So I showed you in one of the banks, the value of the loans given to that bank was set to 3%. That loss from 100 to 3, that was carried by, to put it simplistically, by German savings bank. And if the German savings banks had been in the room in the restructuring phase, they would all have been thinking about their loss from 100 to 3. And that would be a messy, sitting there with a big group of German savings bank. What happened? Well, they all sold out. And they sold out to the hedge funds. And the hedge funds bought at 3. So instead of having a bunch of German savings bank sitting in the room creating problems, as I was thinking about the 97, the room was filled by commercially oriented vulture funds that had bought at 3 and wanted to get out at 6. So if we could do anything that could restructure the economy, that brought the economy back in life and restored some value, those guys would be super happy. And by the way, because the losses they had already written off were so immense that provided funds that actually could be used partially to solve the other problem. Example, arrangements were made that foreclosures were not permitted, right? So the indebted households, they could not lose their houses because the banks were prohibited from doing foreclosures. And how could that be done? Well, that could be done partially because the banks were owned by the vulture funds. So bring them in and get rational players on the scene. And I know this is very provoking, and you can argue against it and so and so and so, but that was the specific experience from this case. And it's often so. You need to have people in the room that are rational, that can think about the future, and that really can address the issues at hand, as opposed to bringing with you the entire history every time you start to open a debate.
Thank you very much.
And I will give a special offer if you don't have the credit card. We can, and everyone else. I'm sure together with the Norwegian Embassy, we can find some arrangement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harold. So we will have a break of 25 minutes. We'll be back to the fourth panel at 3:10 p.m. For the registration, we can start at 3 p.m. for the newcomers, and see you in a while. Thank you very much.